Understanding the nature of the developing conflict with Russia is critical to containing the dangers. Understanding the nature of the developing conflict with Russia is critical to containing the dangers. Many Americans regard it as a clear matter of aggression, a case of a revanchist leader intent on restoring the bygone Moscow Empire, shutting down democracy, and even expelling the United States from Europe. They believed that the situation required deterrence rooted in Churchillian determination. The only question is how strong our countermeasures must be to resuscitate our enemy. Will the prospect of punitive sanctions suffice, or should we threaten a proxy
war? The prospect of a possible attack has tried to
Russia's
discourage Russia from taking military action.
However, war is not always the product of offensive ambition. Some begin when one country's defensive actions are perceived as threatening by another and result in a spiral of action and reaction. Each party believes that its own actions are reasonable and necessary. Each blamed the other for the aggression and demanded respect for its red line of security. In such situations, relying solely on deterrence and punishment can amplify the other party's perceived threat and fuel the flames of conflict. The starkly contrasting US and Russian narratives of the looming crisis in Ukraine fit this pattern. Through Western eyes, NATO's expansion has been driven by local demand rather than Western recruits, as Eastern Europeans too familiar with Moscow's heavy hand have sought refuge within the alliance. Russia's insistence that NATO prohibit further expansion eastward is seen as a threat to the security of its neighbors and a destabilizing challenge to the principle that all countries should be free to join defense alliances. NATO has done nothing comparable to Russia's mass of roughly 100,000 combat troops near the Ukrainian border, its continued support for pro-Russian fighting in eastern Ukraine, and the 2014 annexation of the Crimean Peninsula. To say that Russia sees the situation differently would be an understatement. NATO's post-Cold War expansion looks like an aggressive siege of Russia's borders carried out at a time when Russia was weak. Western support for so-called Democrats in the ex-Soviet republics emerged as a cynical empowerment of ethno-nationalists intent on stripping and disenfranchising key parts of their government. From Moscow's point of view, America asserted its right to intervene in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Syria to protect the local population from a tyrannical central government but denied Russia's equal rights in Ukraine and Georgia. The actions of each party are consistent with this perception. Growing concerns about NATO have prompted the expansion of Russia's military activities across the alliance and near US borders. President Vladimir Putin recently argued that America only responds to Russia's concerns when confronted with military might. In 2018, he emphasized the unveiling of a sophisticated new nuclear weapon, saying it was a reaction to years in which Washington had ignored Russia's security concerns. "Listen to us now," he demanded. In turn, Russia's actions have fueled American concerns about Russian revanchism and prompted NATO to increase naval and air patrols near Russia's borders in Eastern Europe. The view that Russia only understands the language of violence is gaining popularity in Washington. Such a deep action-reaction cycle can be very difficult to break. They demand mutual introspection, empathy, and moral courage, which are quite rare among individuals, let alone governments. They often need to fight the winds blowing in domestic politics. President Joe Biden is well aware that his political opponents will be quick to press for appeasement if he deigns to address Moscow's request to end NATO's military involvement in Ukraine. Surprising as it may sound to Americans, many Russians believe that Putin has long been too eager to make deals with the West and too lenient in defending Russia's security against American interference. For Putin, ignoring the insistence that NATO withdraw from Russia's borders will not only jeopardize Russia's national security. Despite these difficulties, breaking the dangerous spiral of escalation with Russia is critical to US national security. Few Americans believe that we should defend Ukraine head-on with conventional military force, but many in our government and media advocate unconventional warfare, crippling Russia's economy through draconian sanctions. Arm and train Ukrainians to kill Russian invaders, and use cyber weapons to damage or cripple Russia. Operation. The belief that we should bleed Putin's nose is based on the assumption that he will not strike back. That is a potentially dangerous assumption. Putin has threatened a complete severing of ties with the United States in response to tough American sanctions, and he has been tough on China in recent months to show he has alternatives to push with the West. A former Russian general now serving in the State Duma has warned that Russia may attack NATO forces in Eastern Europe if necessary. Just a few months ago, Russia conducted a successful anti-satellite missile test, and its state television announced that it had the ability to disable America's entire global positioning system. Digital television, and cloud computing we all depend on. Unlike Russia, The United States has not yet built a ground reserve that could function in the event of a GPS being lost. Russia also suffers from erroneous assumptions. Putin may be at least partly right that Washington will only negotiate when faced with the prospect of power. But he would be wrong if he believed that Washington would continue to negotiate if those powers were exercised. The current spiral of escalation between the United States and Russia will increase, not decrease, even after Russia's limited invasion of Ukraine. Any exchange of attacks on critical Russian and American infrastructure could have grave consequences. There is still time for diplomacy to prevent such an escalation, but that will only be possible if Washington and Moscow recognize the need to move past the common threat and find a face-saving compromise on their core issues: Russia's demands for NATO to withdraw from their periphery, and Western pressures for Eastern Europe to be safe from Russian attacks.